Thank you very much, Dr. Levy, and we'll have an opportunity in breakouts to comment and add to his remarks. And Dr. Woodcock, you're up next. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good. This is Janet Woodcock. Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to speak to everyone. I don't have any slides. And I really appreciated what we just heard. And I agree with much of what was said, but I'd like to take a step back and talk about the overall clinical trial ecosystem using the response to the pandemic as a worked example. And I really think we all have to acknowledge that the US clinical trial ecosystem did not have an optimal response to the pandemic. And what do I mean by that? Well, in an emergency, a public health emergency, such as the one that we have undergone, I think the goal should be to generate actionable data, really robust, solid data as rapidly as possible so we can improve the standard of care, improve outcomes of the disease, and mitigate the disease as much as possible. And for therapeutics, instead what we saw, we got really hundreds of small trials. In the US, more than 500 trials. Many of them were non-randomized. Using generous criteria, only 5% of the trial arms of these trials were designed to yield actionable data. In other words, data that could be used by regulators or used by guideline groups to alter the standard of care. And that means they were randomized trials and they were adequately powered for whatever endpoint they were studying in population. And frankly, even of those, as we followed those trials over time, many of which were duplicative of each other, studying many of the same compounds in small trials around the country, and this also was around the globe, we saw the same pattern. Many of the trials did not enroll rapidly or adequately at all. And so even if they were theoretically adequately powered, they did not read out, they did not finish, and they were not able to yield any kind of actionable results. So in a crisis, we are left with a lot less evidence than we could have had, and that the system could have delivered had it been more organized, more focused on the societal goal, and generally, more effective. I think we need to take a hard look at this problem and this reaction and approach to the pandemic, understand what contributed to it, and make changes in the system. Because this is simply a worked example of what I think is happening in general to clinical trials around the world, which is we have many underpowered trials. We have many problems with evidence development. As was just said, we have many chronic diseases, many serious diseases that really aren't being studied because of the barriers of clinical evaluation. And we also don't really know how to best manage the armamentarium that we have and treat patients with the huge variety sometimes of interventions that can be offered. So I think many entities, though, have been and still are comfortable with the status quo because it works for them. We have known and we have talked about this problem for over a decade, including in this forum and many similar fora over time. So it isn't as if we didn't know this was going to be the problem. And it isn't as if there wasn't time to make alterations. It's simply that people, I think, lack the motivation because those involved, the system was working adequately for them, although clearly it was suboptimal for many. We need to understand what contributed to this outcome and then make changes that are really substantive changes. And so what should we do? We have been talking about this. I certainly have been talking about this for a decade or more. I believe that what we saw with the pandemic was certainly simply the expected outcome of the system that we have. I would like to say, I think right now, the academic networks that we have in place are not the answer. We will do a whole lessons learned on this separately because through Operation Warp Speed and the ACTIVE project, many of the academic networks were utilized, and we have learned many things about them, but I don't think that's the whole solution. In fact, what we have seen is that concentration of research at academic medical centers means competition for patients, competition for study personnel and other resources. And meanwhile, vast number of people with the disease, in this case with COVID-19, are cared for in other settings and have no opportunity to participate in clinical research. And so not only is research slowed, we don't generate the evidence that we need, but those people and practitioners have lost out on the chance to participate, contribute, and maybe even benefit from the research that's being done. What I suggest we do is that we collectively build a community-based trial network for the next time around. We need to have enough capacity out there in the community to participate in clinical research. And we can't just build it at the time that we have a medical emergency, a public health emergency happening. Community sites, we learned during this pandemic, can be supported by specialized CROs or other organizations that supply the education and expertise to enable clinical research, central IRBs and simplified data that can be collected from electronic health records that are now ubiquitous, can lower the procedural costs as well as the monetary costs. In between the next time around for a pandemic, we should practice and generate actionable evidence on important questions in the care of people with chronic diseases, as we just heard. There are many, many neglected diseases where we need new treatment or we need to improve our treatment. I suggest that this be a government-supported activity, recognizing that it is as important for pandemic preparedness as having adequate supplies of PPE. Just as we can't generate material just in time for a pandemic, neither can we conjure a functional network out of thin air. We need a national clinical trial capacity stockpile, just as we need a stockpile of medicines and equipment. And this stockpile cannot sit idle, waiting for a pandemic to occur. It needs to be vibrant and functional, well-trained, evidence generation capacity that is utilized in between emergencies to answer the pressing societal questions of healthcare for Americans. So in case of emergency, then we need the capacity and the discipline to really randomize the first patient. The other thing we saw was our response was so decentralized that we've tripped all over each other and did a lot of duplicative work. Just like any emergency, we need to prepare and practice by doing clinical research in these new and somewhat unconventional ways. Learning to generate evidence efficiently and effectively within the process of care outside of the academic centers is a really worthy objective. It could pay back in actionable evidence well before the next disaster strikes. So my question I leave for you, and I'd like to discuss about the clinical trial ecosystem as it stands now and we foresee it in the future, will we be prepared next time? Will we be able to respond and learn very quickly the best treatments for our patients if this happens again? Thank you.